best or the worst of it. I hope you make the best of it.
Hello, health champions. Welcome to the Wellness Code. Today we are going to talk about the top cancer fighting foods, the best foods to starve cancer. But in order to make any sense of what those foods are, we first need to understand what cancer likes. If we are going to starve cancer, what is it that feeds it? The primary cause of cancer is glucose. There's something called the Warburg effect, which we'll discuss in detail shortly. There is also chronic inflammation, carcinogenic compounds, and different chemicals that can cause mutations in cells and drive the conversion from a healthy cell to a cancer cell. Additionally, a lot of oxidative stress can create an environment where cancers thrive. When we have a weak immune system, we can't fight off cancer effectively. The normal situation is that a certain number of cells go bad on a regular basis, but with a normal immune system, we can clean that up. If your immune system isn't working, that might give cancer the upper hand. There are also some hormonal imbalances that can drive cancer, and then there is gut health, because a dysbiotic gut, if you have an imbalance in your bacterial flora, can affect virtually every one of these other factors. I gave each one of these items a little icon just so we can illustrate a couple of things along the way. But the number one thing we have to understand about these factors is that when we talk about cancer-fighting foods, or the best foods for this or that, most people start thinking with a pill mentality. They think they're going to find that superfood that's going to go in and strike out all the evil in the body, but it doesn't work like that. First, we have to realize that there are certain things causing cancer, and unless we stop putting those factors in, there's nothing else we can do to make it better. So, the first thing we have to do is to avoid all the different factors that give cancer the upper hand. Then, we want to figure out what are some really good foods, some categories, some types of food, that can help the body, strengthen the immune system, etc., and might be able to offset or compensate for some of these factors. The Warburg effect basically observes that cancer cells prefer glucose. They're different from your normal cells, they come from your body's own cells but have changed. In that change, they now behave differently and prefer different fuel. There are basically two ways that a cell can make energy, whether it's a normal body cell or a cancer cell. The first way is called glycolysis, and the other way is called oxidative phosphorylation, OX4s. OX4s is where we make ATP from ADP. Glycolysis can happen when there is no oxygen present. It doesn't need oxygen to perform that reaction, whereas oxidative phosphorylation requires oxygen. There are two types of fuel. One is glucose, and glucose can go into either of these two pathways. If we use some other substrate, primarily fat, it can only enter into the OX4s pathway. You can only burn fat in the presence of oxygen. But glucose can be used either way. A normal, healthy body cell, acting well behaved, is going to use primarily OX4s because we typically have oxygen present. When we don't, that normal body cell can also rely on glycolysis, but it's not going to be as much because, as I said, oxygen is the normal situation. However, a cancer cell is not well behaved, and therefore, we also have leafy greens, which contain certain types of fiber and polyphenols, and cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage. These also have lots of good compounds, some fiber, and other compounds that can selectively feed and create a good variety in your gut. If you haven't figured it out yet, in addition to the foods I mentioned, there are many other good, real foods as well. So, don't limit yourself to just these. Even though these foods are a little special in some ways, they're not unique, they're not the only ones you want to eat. I started off by saying that while it's important what you eat, it's even more important what you don't eat. So let's compare and contrast a little bit on these 7 different mechanisms that create cancer and see what processed food does for them. First, we have high sugar and white flour in processed foods. They're going to be primarily made from sugar and white flour, which will raise blood sugar. So, immediately, we are violating the principle of not feeding the cancer. We also need to understand that long-term intake of sugar and white flour will drive chronic inflammation. It's the most common mechanism in driving insulin resistance and chronic inflammation. So now, we immediately knock out the second principle of chronic inflammation, we violate that. Processed food that's high in sugar and white flour is also going to create a lot of oxidative stress. Again, a strike for oxidative stress here. Additionally, these processed foods are going to contain a lot of chemicals, artificial sweeteners, artificial flavorings, artificial colors, pesticide, stabilizers, preservatives, etc. Not only are some of these potentially carcinogenic, and maybe we don't find out for another few years, but a lot of things used in some countries are banned in other countries. These chemicals will also create oxidative stress and inflammation. So again, it doesn't just affect one thing. Something that's really bad can strike out lots of different things. Already, we have 4 out of 7 things here with a strike. Processed foods also create immune system compromise. They place an additional burden on your immune system, so we get a big red X on immunity from processed foods. So, how are processed foods for hormones? We know that sugar and white flour will drive blood sugar, insulin, and insulin resistance, and insulin will deregulate estrogen, as we talked about earlier. But also, many of these chemicals added to food act as endocrine disruptors, meaning they unbalance your hormone system. Many of these chemicals have a shape and size similar to a hormone and fit into the same receptor, confusing the body. They may block something and stimulate it, or fit into it and stop it, so you get too much or not enough of something because of this endocrine dysregulation. Processed food is pretty good at messing up your hormone system too. What about gut health? What does processed food do for that? Once we understand how closely tied gut health is to all of these different factors, and we see now I've added arrows mostly going in both directions, meaning that these mechanisms cause dysbiosis, imbalance, pathogenic overgrowth, and dysregulation of your biome, but then that unbalanced gut will further create more problems and worsen all of these different things, we start to realize that processed food is just not a good idea. 90% of what you eat should be something other than processed food. When we mess with it, when we add chemicals and repackage it, it just doesn't work like food anymore. Here's one example of such an item. It's very popular. I'm not going to call it out by name, but you've all heard of it. If an ingredient list looks like this, it's absolutely not something you want to consume. But here's the scariest part. We have all this food, we have a culture where there are thousands of products with ingredient lists like this, and then they try to help you understand this food by giving you something called nutrition facts. The only thing you get to evaluate whether this is good or bad is how many calories it has. We've just gone through and shown that all 7 of the different mechanisms that cause cancer are heavily influenced by these different factors and chemicals, and then we get a label where we try to understand this based on calories and a few different grams. This label does not tell the story. Learn to understand what real food is, and eat almost exclusively real food. If you enjoyed this video, you are going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.